Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I think you all know by now that the University of Maryland, Baltimore is governed by a Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents meets every month, and I go to every meeting. I've gone to every meeting probably in 20 years because you always learn interesting things about what other universities are doing. But there's been a recurring theme the last 5 years, and the recurring theme is the word civics. We don't teach enough civics to our students. Now, you have to understand, here's a surgeon sitting there in a regents meeting, and they're talking about civics? Really? Do we really talk about that on our campus? And I would have generally said, well, this is the boring part of the discussion. However, in the last couple of years, that's changed. It's changed a whole lot. Suddenly, something that I took for granted, that was ninth grade, right? Ninth grade civics. Some of you maybe had it earlier or later. Why suddenly do we need to be focusing on civics in this great country where we all know it's always been on the straight and narrow? We know where it's going. And of course, we know our process. Well, I've learned over the past 2 years that there's so little I know about real civics from the law school point of view. I've learned a lot. In the past, we've had projects. You just heard one, generative AI. We've had them on the grid over in the biopark. There's been a lot of recommendations that have come out of these presidents' symposia and white papers. And I would have never guessed that civics would have been a topic. And now it's really time to do that. And it's really time for this university and its students to not take that for granted like I, as a surgeon, always took for granted. So the purpose of this President's Symposium and white paper is really to have a group of fellows, students from all the schools on the campus, to talk about this as an issue, as a potential opportunity to improve this university's campus on our local area, our city, our state, maybe even nationally. And I champion this happening because I think this is a wonderful thing. Now, the symposia were started in around 2011. I think that's when Dr. Ward, somewhere where Dr. Ward got here, and although he's not here today, has really been the driving force of making this happen. And so I certainly owe him a debt of gratitude for that. The purpose, though, has been twofold. One selfish, one is altruistic. The selfish part is UMB has always gotten something good out of this. We have things to show that are better on this campus because of this program. And of course, the students who do the fellowship for a year, I hope, get a lot out of this too. They get mentorship, they get guidance, they get to see parts of the university that perhaps they would have never seen. So it's really been a productive thing. And I'm sure this year will be productive, just as productive as in the past. Now, our speaker is a professor in the School of Law. Professor, I have to get out of the habit of doctor. Professor Max Stearns, who is, I have to read this part, the Venable Bajer and Howard Professor in the Francis King Carey School of Law. He is a student of these issues of civics, of the Constitution, of what we could do to improve this country. I've heard him speak before. He's got a book out which he will hold up in front of you, and that shows you how scholarly activity can influence this country. And so he's going to give a talk, which you see on the screen here now, and I really agree with the now more than ever. So Max, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here and to be the kickoff speaker in this year's faculty advisor as well for this presidential white paper series, which I'll confess I didn't know as much about. My understanding is that the program brings together students from across our rich and varied professional schools here at the university to tackle important questions affecting our community, but as President Jarrell said, even beyond our community, and to suggest concrete proposals that will improve our institution, that might actually be an inspiration for other institutions also to follow. This year's project, as President Jarrell said, involves thinking carefully about civics. I'm going to say about democracy and how this university can develop resources to help members of our community, of our academic community, better understand American civics. And this includes learning that goes well beyond what we were taught in middle and high school. President Jarrell apparently in ninth grade. I think that probably corresponds to a lot of our experience that we last thought about civics, except those of us who hang out at Merrill and Carey Law, which we never stopped thinking about civics. But for other professionals on the campus, the last real sojourn may have been in middle or high school. And I think this is especially important in this uniquely challenging historical period that we are all experiencing every morning when we wake up. I will start by saying our democracy is under threat. Now, I could list specific indications. I'm fairly confident that in the Q&A, we'll have an opportunity to talk about specific examples that are on your minds. But for now, I want to convey that the concerns that I see go beyond partisan politics in any traditional sense. We've been in a constitutional crisis for many years, and I'm persuaded that no single leader alone has caused the crisis, and no single election alone is capable of ending it. Instead, to come out of the crisis that we face, we have to first understand its root causes and devise an appropriate remedy. The markers of the crisis cut across traditional ideological or party lines. One, a widening distance separating the two major parties, dividing us into teams that no longer assume members of the other team are behaving or acting in good faith. Two, a desire for more choices than the ones that we have, but an apparent inability to bring about meaningful third parties into our politics. And three, a decreasing trust in the capacity of Congress or the Supreme Court to operate as a meaningful check on the increasingly powerful executive branch. Now, it hasn't always been this way, and asking why and what to do gets to the heart of the seemingly troubled project of American democracy, just as it stresses the need for this year's presidential white paper project. The goal is to encourage the university to create meaningful opportunities for a broad understanding among members of our community across all of the schools of American civics. This is especially important on this campus, which trains professionals who vitally depend on robust, well-functioning democratic institutions to help their clients and also to serve the public in the varied professions that comprise this. But understanding this requires rethinking some very basic intuitions many of us hold about our civics, our Constitution, and our democracy. What I propose isn't easy. It demands no less than transforming the system we have into a thriving multi-party parliamentary democracy. Now, I know skeptics are going to claim that's impossible, but I want to argue that the most commonly discussed reform proposals, the ones that superficially appear less ambitious, actually are less plausible. But more importantly than that, they're incapable of solving the crisis that we are finding ourselves in. The slide did not advance. Can somebody just tell? Oh, there we go. Should be the second slide there. If you can make that work. Beautiful. All right. Taking the crisis seriously demands first, identifying what's needed to fix it, and second, figuring out, once we know what we need to do, how to actually make that achievable. Now, I spent 4 years writing this book, which explains how we got here and how to fix the crisis that we face. The title, Parliamentary America, also has a subtitle, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy, which is to say, I'm proposing something radical, but I'm convinced it's least radical. It's the least radical thing we can do that will actually extricate us from this crisis. One of the centerpieces of the book I call the third-party dilemma. And as I was preparing the talk, I remembered that that was originally the title I had in mind for this book, was the third-party dilemma. In our system, single representatives elected nationally, the president by the states, we're talking about the Senate, and in individual House districts, at least since about the 1840s, in winner-take-all contests, inevitably produce two major parties. This is contrary to the dynamic game that the framers of the Constitution envisioned, and in the modern era, it has put us in crisis. In the information age, which corresponds roughly to the early mid-1990s, the two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, have grown so far apart, so distant, that each regards the other as lacking basic intelligence or as evil. Our system is winner-take-all at every conceivable level. I'm going to focus specifically on the presidency. Two-party presidentialism makes it impossible for either party to relinquish any of its supporters, no matter how problematic those supporters may be, because doing so, giving up some of your constituency, risks throwing victory and with it political power entirely to the other side. That scheme risks a leader who embraces autocratic goals and who is indifferent or hostile to inconvenient democratic norms, taking over one party and ultimately seizing ultimate control of the government as a whole. We have third parties, but they punish rather than reward voters who support them. In the book, I call this the third party dilemma. Voting for third parties throws support to the major party candidate the voter least favors. We've recently seen three efforts to create third parties, and remarkably across the political spectrum. Andrew Yang, we could call him liberal. Joe Manchin, RFK Jr., at one point people would have called them moderates. And Elon Musk, people would call conservative. Each of those efforts has failed. In fact, Musk's America Party is particularly notable. A lot of people claim if we could just overturn the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, which seems to give corporations unlimited power to spend in politics, that will fix the crisis we are in. And yet, think about this. Even the wealthiest man in America, and I think the world, couldn't ignite a viable third party. Money in politics is inevitable. But institutional structures make the influence of money more or less benign. Our pathology is two-party presidentialism. The question is how to channel resources, including money, to create space for third parties to emerge and thrive. And this includes rewarding rather than punishing those who support third parties. So how do we get here? Well, my book relies on a bunch of familiar references. I wrote the book not for academics. I wrote the book for a general educated public who care deeply about what they're observing every single day happening to their democracy. And so I wanted to find reference points that people would be able to relate to. And the one thing that everybody can relate to is back when they used to go to the playground. So I would refer them back to childhood games and other cultural references. The framers of the Constitution envisioned a very different game than the one that we presently observe. And we could call this rock, paper, scissors. And it's a game that you all remember. You probably played it or watched children play it in elementary school. And the rules are pretty simple. Scissors cut paper. Paper covers rock. Rock crushes scissors. Now, when you go from that elementary school playground to the math class, you discover a concept called transitivity. And even law students don't find this too mathy. It's a pretty simple idea. 10 is greater than 5, 5 is greater than 2, and yes, 10 is greater than 2. Now, it turns out not all relationships are transitive. Some are intransitive. Rock, paper, scissors endlessly entertains children because it's an intransitive game. So we know that scissors defeat paper, paper defeats rock, rock defeats scissors, scissors defeats paper. It's called a cycle. Okay. Now, how does it work in our constitutional system? How did the framers envision the rock, paper, scissors idea of a constitution? So here's what we know. Congress sends bills to the president, but the president can veto those bills. So the president beats Congress. The Supreme Court can strike down bills that the president supports or even executive orders on constitutional grounds. Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress. Using transitivity, that means that the Supreme Court beats Congress, except Congress, with respect to statutory rulings, can overturn Supreme Court rulings with regular legislation. And even with constitutional rulings, Congress can initiate the amending process. So therefore, the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, but Congress beats the Supreme Court. Cool. Except the framers actually even went a step beyond that. And it would be a little bit like saying to the kids on the playground, let's make your game more fun. Here's what we'll do. We'll add these rules to the game. In this game, paper covers the scissors sit on top of the rock, and the rock punctures a hole in the paper. So we'll call that game scissors, paper, rock. And you get to simultaneously play scissors, paper, rock, and rock, paper, scissors. How did the framers envision the reverse game? So it's true that the president can veto bills sent by Congress, but it's also true Congress can override presidential vetoes with a 2/3 vote in each house. So Congress beats the president. The Supreme Court can strike down laws enacted by Congress. So the Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president, back to transitivity. That means the Supreme Court beats the president, except one of the greatest powers that the president has upon the retirement or death of a justice is appointments, which can actually change the direction of doctrine, change the direction of our constitutional law. So the Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president beats the Supreme Court. We have a rock, paper, scissors, scissors, paper, rock constitution, but actually it would be better to just call it a unicycle constitution. Don't think of a bicycle, because the problem with the bicycle is, well, it's not a problem, it's actually an asset if you're riding on a bicycle, is that if it's on a good bicycle and you have momentum and pedal backwards, you still go forward. But by contrast, on a unicycle, when you pedal forward, you go forward. When you pedal backward, you go backward, unless it's me, in which case you just fall over. But nonetheless, the basic idea is we have cycles in both directions, and we have to give him a rest. So we'll just go to the blank slide. So we have a unicycle constitution in the vision of the framers. And what the framers really thought was that we would have benign jealousies in each of these institutions. Everybody would imagine it's okay to lose a game once in a while because there are going to be later rounds. I'm going to lose now, but I'm going to win later because every one of these institutions will sometimes win, sometimes lose. Every institution can either defeat or be defeated by every other institution. So if we take the long view, this endless set of games among the three branches of government created in the Constitution will create benign jealousies that will allow this system to function. We'll call that the American exceptionalism account. This is probably what you learned in 9th grade or 10th grade when you studied American civics. And it is a lovely story. It warms the heart. There's only one problem with it. It's not true. And it actually never was true. You see, even in George Washington's farewell address, so kind of a long time ago, he recognized that this vision of benign jealousies across our institutions didn't characterize the actual nature of the politics that he was fighting to sustain in his presidency. Instead, he saw partisanship increasingly intense, or what the framers referred to as factions, breaking down the benign game that the framers of the Constitution had in mind. And a way to think about this is to ask yourself this question. If you were trying to figure out whether a system really is wise, really is meritorious, would you ask, can I come up with an example, just a single example, that has outlasted others in the world? Or maybe what you would ask is this a system that has been benignly adapted across varying conditions again and again? And I think most people, whether they're scientists, whether they're engineers, whether they're systems builders, whether they're musicians thinking of genres, would say that's easy. That's easy. What I'm looking for is the system that has been benignly adapted across conditions again and again. And if that's the test, our system fails. You see, we've exported democracy around the globe. Not once have we successfully exported the American system of two-party presidentialism, because it never worked the way it was supposed to, and it is a fundamentally problematic system. So what went wrong? What happened? I'm going to bring you back to the playground, but this time I'm taking you back to the part of the playground where preschoolers are hanging out. And depending on where you grew up, that would either be referred to as a seesaw or a teeter-totter. It's a pretty simple game. You get one kid on one side, you get one kid on the other. As one kid rides up, the other goes down, and vice versa, and they stay happily entertained for some reasonable period of time. And it turns out that it's not a bad metaphor for thinking about a basic framing of our politics that many of us also learned in middle school or high school. And it goes something like this. Imagine that we have a candidate for president who is conservative, marked by C, on the right side of our political spectrum. And imagine that we have a candidate on the other side that we'll call liberal, marked by L. We could call the conservative a Republican. We could call the liberal a Democrat. Now, the MV in the middle is kind of geeky political science speak for median voter. So the idea is that if these two candidates start at opposite extremes and they just want to get more and more votes, what they're going to do is they're going to move gradually in their positions toward that median voter to the point where they crash, and there's really not a lot of daylight between their positions. And what's interesting about this model, which is called the median voter theorem, is that at a particular point in our history, it was actually fairly descriptive. If you go back to the 1952 presidential election, it's really striking for folks who are much younger to imagine this as possibly having happened, but it did. Both of the major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, wanted the same person to be the head of their ticket, Dwight D. Eisenhower. They both tried to court the same. Imagine that today. The Democrats and Republicans both going after the same. It's unthinkable, right? It's unthinkable. But what's particularly notable is that at the time, let me back up and make one more comment about it. Let me go back one slide. Yeah. This idea of the two parties converging on the center, you can intuitively see, doesn't leave a lot of space for third parties. They squeeze out third parties. And any of you see the movie A Beautiful Mind, the John Nash story? It's a fantastic book and it's a fantastic movie. So this is Russell Crowe playing John Nash, and that's the actual John Nash getting his Nobel Prize in economics for the theorem or the idea, Nash equilibrium, bearing his name. When you have a direct election, the pure Nash equilibrium, meaning just the dominant strategy for our purposes, is you end up with two major parties. It goes back to the idea that neither side can give up any of their base, or they risk throwing support to the other side. And you see that with the idea of convergence squeezing out space for third parties. And as I say, this was sort of descriptive at a particular point in our history. What's also notable about this is Anthony Downs, an economist writing in the 1950s, the era of Dwight D. Eisenhower, popularized this notion. There's a reason why it's in all of our minds. It's actually in the ether of the lessons that we learn about American civics. The idea is we have a single dimension left to right. In order to capture more votes, they're going to move toward the center, and we're going to end up with centrist governance, sometimes a little to the left, sometimes a little to the right. That's okay, because we're in it for the long game, and if we lose this election, there's a future election, and it all works out in the end. What's also particularly striking about this, especially by modern lights, is that the American Political Science Association, which is the largest political science association in the world and the most influential one in the United States, they wrote a study and critique of the two-party system in the same period of time. And this is really unimaginable for folks who are coming of age today. Their main critique of our two-party system in the 1950s was the parties are so similar that they don't give voters a meaningful choice. And they wrote a long report about that. It was irresponsible of the parties not to define themselves in foundationally different ways so that voters would actually be choosing something that matters. And in 2022 or 2023, when they revisited this project, their critique of the two-party system was almost diametrically opposed, okay? Which is a rather striking thing. So one thing to think about is, so what's happened? If you go back to Eisenhower, I've already talked about that. Nixon and Kennedy, 1960. There was some policy distance between them, but it wasn't huge as compared, for example, with Bush v. Gore, greater policy distance. But even that wasn't huge as compared with Trump against any of the people he ran against in the general election. Whether we're talking about Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, or Kamala Harris, it is clear that the trend line with respect to our politics has been further and further and further apart. And so the question is, well, what happened? Well, one thing that accounts for some distance is that our election doesn't really look like that. We have a two-stage election. We have a primary and caucus in which a segment of our voters, Democrats and Republicans, choose their candidates. And it's not inconceivable to imagine that something like that median voter theorem applies to each party. So we end up with a median Democrat running against a median Republican. And that gives some distance, but it doesn't explain this kind of trend line of further and further and further apart. And so we have to figure out, well, what is it that has caused this to occur? And I want to suggest that this began to break down in a really fundamental way in the information age, roughly corresponding to the early to mid 1990s, by inverting the relationship that we all have as citizens and as consumers with two vital things to a democracy. One, our relationship as voters to representatives, and two, our relationship as consumers to the news and news-like information that we access. So there's a remarkably compelling book written by David Daley with the unceremonious title Rat Effed, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. And the story that he tells is that after Barack Obama's 2008 election, Republican operatives realized something, that for pennies on the dollar, if they went and pressed on elections that are below the political radar, the elections people aren't paying attention to, state level House and state level Senate races, if they could turn enough purple and blue states red, they could turn the House red and lock it in for a long period of time, because with rare exceptions, state legislative bodies control the apportionment, the lines drawn for the delegations that they sent to the House of Representatives. So they did that. And they did it in a remarkably audacious way. And they thought that they had a lock on the House of Representatives for a period of 20 years. Now, that ended up not being quite so long. They got about 12 years out of it. And this strategy was called red mapping. And basically what they did was, through a series of partisan gerrymanders, stacking the opposition into fewer districts and spreading the wealth of the party in power over more close majority districts, they were able to increase the number of Republicans in the House as compared to Democrats, compared with what the relative registration of voters would suggest that ratio might look like. So, in effect, the consequence of partisan gerrymandering is to make our elections non-competitive. Now, that's not precisely right, because actually, these elections are competitive in the first stage. If you don't give an adequate strength to your party in your voting record, you might be primaried, which is to say, somebody will come in and challenge you who's willing to give the folks back home the stronger voting record that they want. The problem is that although the primaries and caucuses make these races competitive, they turn red states redder and blue states bluer. In a scheme of partisan gerrymandering, we don't choose our representatives. Our representatives effectively choose us. And you can see how significant this has become. I talked about redlining. It occurs on both sides. You end up, I don't mean redlining, I mean red mapping. You also have blue mapping, right? States that are democratically controlled play a similar game. There are particular reasons why Republicans have a historical advantage at the game, but you can see Texas versus Illinois playing that game. And those of you who are paying attention to this, Texas and California have been fighting each other over these districting games, knowing that a consequence may ultimately be which party controls the House of Representatives as a result of these games. The second development in the information age relates to our interaction with media through social media. Now, this is the media bias chart. It was created by a company called Ad Fontes Media, a public benefit corporation out of Colorado. Full disclosure, the woman who created this, her name is Vanessa Otero. She's a very good friend of mine, and I am on her board of advisors. So I have some involvement in this particular project. And what this graphic does is it shows you that, and by the way, this is an older version of the graphic. It happens to be the version that appeared in my book. So they keep running new information, new versions of this. The right-left line is ideological bias, conservative to liberal. The north-south line is basically reliability versus non-reliability. And in the era of social media and social media algorithms, the incentive structure for social media companies, whether we're talking about Facebook, we're talking about X, we're talking about TikTok, whatever it happens, I should have said Meta or X or TikTok, whatever the company is, the incentive structure is to keep each of us actively engaged on the page through likes, clicks, and shares. And what the algorithms reveal to these companies is that centrist, balanced, up the middle stories. This is one side. This is the other side. What do you think, right? That's not what keeps people actively engaged. Traditional media sources occupy that space. But what keeps people actively engaged in their feed is stories that either affirm that they're on the righteous team, one set of extremes, or feed them the opposite extreme, so with their team members, they can denigrate the other side as lacking basic intelligence or as evil. As with the House of Representatives or our voting to our state legislative bodies, in a world of partisan gerrymandering, we don't choose our representatives, they choose us. In a world of social media, we don't choose our news and news-like sources. News and news-like sources are choosing us. If there's a mantra for social media, well, there is a mantra for social media. If you're not paying, you are the product, not the consumer. The advertisers are the customers. We are the product. And to reward the customers, these companies are keeping us actively engaged in ways that further divide us. And this is really part of the problem. And so you might think, well, this is just kind of impressionistic. It's not. If you look at the data from the Pew Research Center, what you see is that beginning in the earliest period that they've identified in this graphic, there was considerable overlap between the parties even in 1994. The parties have moved further and further away until the end date of this graphic. So few liberals identify as Republicans, so few conservatives identify as Democrats by 2017. And anybody who's even casually observing our politics from 2017 until today would clearly recognize that the divide separating us into two teams has only grown dramatically worse. So we have these ever-widening divides. And when you think about it, our politics through partisan gerrymandering is pulling us apart into two teams. Our news media is further pulling us apart into two teams. And the voters who are consuming this are further pulling us apart. And so we have this dynamic set of feedback loops that are just driving a wedge between two societies that barely trust each other, and the capacity of the other side ever to engage in good faith. So it even gets a little worse than that, because you see, most political scientists who study our politics, not just in the US, but also around the globe, recognize that our political system isn't really captured by a single right-left ideological line. Better way to think about it is that there are two axes of our politics. One is the traditional right-left. Are we liberal or conservative on economic policy or public policy questions? But there's another dimension going to culture and identity, which goes north-south. And you could think of this like a window pane, right? A four-box window pane. Well, we have eight in the windows in the room, but you can imagine, right? A four-box window frame. And when you put those together, there we go. If you're conservative on economic policy and culture and identity, we can call that traditional Republican. Conversely, if you're liberal on those two dimensions, we'll call you a Democrat. Historically, people think if you are liberal on economic policy but conservative on culture identity, that is often what people think of as populism. And the flip side of that, if you're liberal on culture and identity but conservative on economic policy, that's the traditional understanding of libertarian, right? So imagine this. Imagine that center horizontal line, which you could call, actually there's an architectural term for that in a window. It's called a muntin. It's what keeps the upper panes above the lower panes. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Darn it. Oh no, didn't work. Okay. So here you'll have to visualize this because I can't get this slide to do what I wanted to do, but that's okay. If you have the capacity to do it, this is a motion slide. Do you have the ability to hit? No, you don't? Okay. So you all work with me. You'll be able to understand this. Imagine the muntin in the middle is the seesaw. Remember, we're thinking seesaw. Okay. So imagine that Donald Trump gets on the right side of the seesaw. And imagine Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris gets on the other side of the seesaw. Everybody with me on this? So here's what happens. Newton's third law of motion becomes our first law of politics. It's a seesaw. As Donald Trump moves us up in the direction of populism, there's an inevitable push down on the other side, right, in the direction of progressivism. Everybody see how that plays out, right? For every action in politics, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And in fact, it's increasingly clear that culture and identity is playing a fundamental role in terms of how people identify themselves in politics, in some respects, more so than specific debates on policy issues. Now, here's a really interesting thing. It's very hard to come up with good examples where every single cohort can agree on something and also be correct, okay? So for a long time in our politics, when the centrists controlled the two major parties, Progressives felt disenfranchised on the Democratic side. And America First, which then becomes MAGA, feels disenfranchised on the conservative side. In the political climate that we're in, as MAGA has taken control of the Republican Party, and as it looks like the progressives might be taking control of the Democratic Party, the centrists of both parties are feeling disenfranchised. This is really a rare instance in which I can actually say all four of those groups not only agree with each other, that our politics ultimately results in their being disenfranchised some of the time, but they're actually correct. Our politics results in their being disenfranchised some of the time, right? As a consequence of the way our game is played. So the question is what to do. And the central conceit of my book is a virtual world tour. I take the readers to 7 democracies around the globe. I take them to England, France, Germany, Israel, Taiwan, Brazil, and Venezuela. Every one of these countries, again, anybody who is even a casual observer of news is well aware. Some of these have had crisis-level problems in recent years, some of which have even developed since the time I published my book in March of 2024, right? But they are different systems. And one of the lessons of the book is there's no system that is actually a perfect democratic system. This is true both as a matter of theory and as a matter of practice. And once we understand that all systems are going to have strengths and weaknesses and there's no perfect solution to democracy, we recognize the choices different systems make. And it turns out that all democracies confront choices on 2 key democratic axes. One, how you elect the lower legislative chamber, which in most democracies has greater influence on policy. In the US, it's more balanced between the 2 chambers. But the second axis is how do you elect and hold accountable the person who runs the government? And it turns out that the only way to create a truly thriving multi-party democracy is to recognize the mistakes, the problems with the choices that we made originally that never allowed the system to work the way it did. We have to go back and rethink fundamentals, because what we ultimately see when you tour these 7 countries, and I think I'm a pretty good tour guide, which makes the book a really good deal, right? 7 countries for the price of a book. I will promise you this. If you read the book and go to those countries, you'll have a better understanding of how that country works. You really will. But what we see is that the threat to democracy across all these countries is extremism in 2 manifestations: a commitment that is unyielding to an ideology, unwilling to put up with the inconveniences of democratic norms. And the other extremism is having too many parties or too few. The too few is what we're experiencing. Can't give up any constituency, so a problematic constituency can ultimately take over a party. If we look, for example, at the history of the Weimar Republic, if we look, for example, at what's happened in Italy, if we look, for example, at what happens in Brazil, or what's happened in other countries that have too many parties, what we discover is that if one political leader gains more seats than any other, that leader can begin rolling over other parties one by one until taking control of the government as a whole. The central lesson of the World Tour is it is the extremism that's the threat, not ideological difference. And so the question becomes, how do you get the sweet spot? And most political scientists agree that there is a system that achieves that sweet spot, which is roughly between 4 and 8 parties. Not too many, not too few. That's the Goldilocks principle. And it turns out that the system that was invented for Germany after World War II, called mixed member proportionality, hybrid system that is parliamentary, uniquely achieves that sweet spot. And in the book, what I do is I explain how it is possible that we can actually amend our Constitution in a way that, unlike all the other proposals, does not threaten the status of sitting members of both houses of Congress. Most proposals that don't require amendments translate into unemployment acts for sitting members of Congress. We've never had a convention. All amendments have come from Congress. And it's hard to imagine members of Congress saying, vote for my unemployment through term limits, through multi-member districts, through ranked choice voting, or any mechanism that does not allow them to keep their existing seat. The system that I propose allows every member of both chambers to keep their existing seat. It works by doubling the size of the House and by having 2 ballots that you cast in the House, one in a district election like now, one by party, and then using the proportional vote state by state to achieve the delegation. And I can explain how that works in the Q&A. I don't want to go on too much longer. But this uniquely would allow, if combined with a second major amendment, coalition governance, giving third parties a meaningful role so that leaders of parties negotiate who is going to head the government, occupying the positions of president and vice president. Suddenly, when you vote for a third party, you don't get everything, but the leaders of that party can negotiate, I'll join your coalition if you give us this, right? And so you will actually gain something rather than be punished by lending your support. So this is Apollonia National Park. It's a stunning ruin facing the Mediterranean Sea. I've visited lots of ruins in my life. I've been fortunate to be able to travel. This was once occupied by 5 ancient civilizations: Illyrians, Greeks, Romans, Mamelukes, and Crusaders. I've been to ruins all over the place. I've been to Pompeii, Angkor Wat, Chichen Itza, Jerusalem. I've been to lots of ruins. And every time I tour them, I have this desire to kind of situate myself there. I want to know what it was like to be an Athenian. What was it like to be a Roman, right? But when I was traveling this one, I was writing the book and something else just hit me. What hit me was I imagined that every civilization that was there was convinced they would be there forever. We humans struggle to appreciate how fleeting it all is. No society, no democracy lasts forever. But I'm convinced that if we teach the public to understand not just what they learned in middle school, the magical story about how wonderful our system is, but how it was designed to work, why it doesn't work that way, what its failures are, that we can actually learn from the experience of other nations that have experienced threats to their democracies, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Broaden our understanding. I am convinced that we can tackle this and come out of this a thriving democracy. And I think that this project connects to this in a significant way. We need people who are going to be leaders across all of the professions that this university teaches to understand that they don't just have an obligation to be outstanding in their profession, they have an obligation to understand what it takes to live in a world where they get to represent the people and to work for the people that they are trained as professionals to take care of, and also to ensure that we have thriving democratic institutions that matter to all of us. So again, thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to be able to speak with you, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very interesting. Just referring to your last point, it just made me wonder, have there been historically any situations you know of where there has been a major transition in political structure that wasn't preceded by a war or an economic crisis or anything of that nature?
Yeah, there actually have been. It's very interesting. Germany right now is actually transitioning. It just voted to change its MMP system, I think, in a potentially interesting way. I could explain what motivated them to do it. Basically, this system called mixed member proportionality has three pressure points. One is you want to make sure that people who are elected in what they call constituency, we call district elections, actually get their seat. The second one is you want the party votes to achieve proportionality. And the third one is that ideally you'd like your legislature to be stable. Well, it turns out that you can demonstrate this mathematically. You can get any two of those three. You can't get all three. And what happened in Germany was that they had a 596 or 598 baseline for their lower chamber called the Bundestag. The upper chamber is called the Bundesrat. The Bundestag, in order to make the math work to achieve their proportionality and make it perfect, inflated to 736. So this put a lot of pressure. There was some other quirks. I mean, I like to say that, nobody's ever come up with a system that Germans can't make more complicated than it needs to be. But they really made it complicated. The mathematics of their system is intensely complicated, but it's also led to this inflation of the Bundestag. I knew the United States is never going to have a variable size House of Representatives. This is not going to happen. I don't think we need to have perfect proportionality. I think we need to have good enough proportionality. So that's that's what I give up. And all we need to do is break up our two-party system. Another example, it's been in the news for lots of reasons. Israel actually, for a period of time that lasted 5 years, actually went from a parliamentary system to what was referred to as a semi-parliamentary, sometimes called semi-presidential system. They actually, at one point, abandoned Knesset coalitions choosing the prime minister in favor of a direct election of prime minister. I think it was from 1995 to 2001. I could be wrong. There were 3 elections in the period, and what happened was striking. So Israel's an example of a country that has, frankly, too many parties, and there's a lot of problems with that. But what's interesting is when they made that switch, there was convergence, as this predicts, to 2 major parties or 2 major coalitions. It actually ended up causing them an opposite problem as compared to the problem that they've seen before. Actually, a lot of democracies around the globe tweak. What's also interesting is the UK has the Westminster system, so it's parliamentary but districted, so they end up with 2 major parties. But within the UK, constituent countries that form the UK actually use MMP for some of their for some of their decision making, and other countries have adapted to MMP. There's a variation called mixed member majoritarian. Some countries in South America, for example, have played with, which ends up being problematic. But there are lots of examples around the world of experimentation. In the United States, one of the inhibitors of experimentation is this misconceived notion going back to middle school civics that we all grew up with if we grew up here. We solved it. This group of folks they figured out democracy. And we know this because our constitutions outlasted others. Virtually everything about those 2 sentences is wrong. But that sensibility is in the ether. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to persuade people we actually can learn from looking outside ourselves.
Thank you, Professor Stearns. Always a pleasure listening to you, and thank you for agreeing to serve as faculty advisor to this project. So this is a devil's advocate question. As someone who grew up in a parliamentary representative system. So if as you argue, the democratic system in the United States is broken and that we could learn from other countries, why is it the United States remain the most potent, powerful, successful country in the world?
So, it's very interesting. What I argue in the book, and I'll argue here, and thank you for those nice words, is that the United States has grown economically in remarkable ways for reasons that are probably in spite of, not because of our unique constitutional system. And there are several factors that contribute to this, some quite tragic, some not so tragic. The tragic one, of course, has to do with the history of enslaved persons coming and our driving labor under the most brutal and horrific conditions longer than pretty much any other nation in the world. One South American counter to that, but generally speaking, really uniquely, right? We are insulated from foreign military threats because we have oceans on both sides of our natural borders, and generally speaking, not throughout our entirety of our history, but for most of it, we've had friendly northern and southern neighbors. We've had a steady influx of immigrants coming from Europe and elsewhere who have been highly motivated to contribute to our economic development. And we have had the capacity, albeit tragically at the expense of Native American tribes, of geographical expansion, out west. So we've had four independent factors that do a very good job at explaining how we became us, that have nothing to do with the system of democracy that the framers came up with and got wrong. It's funny. I'm reminded of a book. I sometimes enjoy helping kids who are applying. Shouldn't advertise this to the world. I sometimes enjoy advising kids who are applying to colleges, thinking about their essays. I like helping kids, and there's a book that I sometimes recommend that they read, and it's called 50 Successful Harvard Essays, and it includes the essays and it gives commentary by the editors. And I always say to the kids who I recommend they read the book, what does it mean by success? Okay, the kid wrote this essay and got into Harvard, but we don't know whether the kid got into Harvard because of or in spite of the essay, right? It could very well be that despite this essay, this kid wound up at Harvard University, right? Similarly here, I think it's a very hard story to tell that our democratic system, which literally from the beginning didn't work the way the framers intended and divided us into two teams that created serious problems throughout our history and are really creating a crisis now, are the reason that we've been successful, as opposed to the despite this, we were successful for other reasons. And I will say that we're doing a pretty good job right now of messing up our international prestige, right? I think we're actually working hard at making sure that we don't live up to periods in our history we really did have prestige on the world stage. Yeah. So thank you.
I'll just restate it. President Gerald asked, what would your project be with this?
Yeah, so I as I envision it, and Sam and I have had several conversations about this, I think that students across the university need to understand how our system works and doesn't work beyond what they learned in school. I think that we need to create some internal institution that can be a resource for graduate students, medical students, dental students, pharmacy students, in nursing students. It may be more natural for people in social work and law, certainly, but nonetheless, for the institution in the graduate program generally, to be able to really gain a deeper understanding of American civics and intuitions about why the system is tragically breaking down. I don't view it as an advocacy program. This is what I do on this is my project. But I think that that this particular project, the white paper project, as I understand it, would be thinking carefully, because I think that universities across the country aren't doing this. I don't think that I think that unfortunately so much of our knowledge is siloed by discipline in professional school, and we're in a period in our history where I don't think we can afford to keep this siloed. I don't care if you're a doctor, dentist, nurse, pharmacist, you're a leader in your community. One thing I'm convinced of is that people always look to professionals as leaders beyond the specifics of their profession, right? I mean, this is just the way the world is. You have somebody who has stature in your community, and you have a conversation with them, you're going to care about their insight, maybe disproportionately to their knowledge, but we can help people to actually have more knowledge. And, it's funny, there's a quote, it was by Samuel Johnson. I had never seen it. It was actually carved into one of the walls. And I will someday come back and take a picture and post it on social media. It says there are two kinds of knowledge. There are things that you know, and there's the kind of knowledge about where to find things out, right? What you need to learn. And I say this to my students all the time. I give them a list of courses that are not required in our curriculum. Crystal Edwards knows that I say this to my students. I say, here are the 6 courses that, although not required in our curriculum, you must take. And I tell them, if you take, I'll just give one example. Tax law, I'll give 2, business associations. That's not going to make you a tax lawyer or a transaction lawyer, but here's what it will do. It will give you a sufficient familiarity that if something crosses your desk where you need to consult a tax lawyer or a BA lawyer, you'll know, I need to consult a tax lawyer or a BA lawyer. I'm not expecting, I don't think it's reasonable to expect graduate students and other programs to know as much as my con law students, but they can know enough to know what they don't know and where to find out, especially if the university provides some institutional place where they can access that knowledge. That's what I'm thinking. Of course, I'd be delighted to hear what you're thinking, but that's what I'm thinking.
What's going on right now? A year ago, I would have never thought that. So that would be my answer.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'll second that.
Thank you very much. I can imagine that the discussions in your courses are very interesting, and I'm wondering what gives you hope, and if some of that hope comes from the hopefully civic civil discourse happening in your class.
What gives me hope? So, it's interesting. I say this in the book, and I mean it. I think as citizens, we have sort of 2 moral obligations in this moment. One is to open our minds. Right. At the very beginning of my book, I say to the readers, I say, I'm only asking one thing of you before you turn the page. Have an open mind. I'm proposing something really radical here. So just before the turn the page, I'm asking you, suspend your disbelief long enough to have an open mind and be willing to consider you might learn something, or you might think about a problem in a new way. And then later in the book, I say, there's another thing that we all need to have as a moral obligation. I just believe it in my soul. Hope. Because what's the alternative? So I'll just say this. In May, I became a grandparent for the first time, which gives me hope, right? And I like to hope that everybody who has children and grandchildren want a better future for them. The dedication of my book is really simple. At the beginning, it's to my children and yours. That's it. What gives me hope is that I actually think people care about the future, not just for their own progeny, but for future generations. I really like to believe that even people who are supportive of policies and candidates that I struggle to imagine supporting intuitively recognize there's a problem here. We can have a better world, And one of the things about multi-party democracy that is so much better than what we have now, the campaigns we have now are campaigns of denigration. If you're campaigning in a multi-party democracy, you have to be able to say to voters, I want your support. I want to be your first choice. But if I'm not your first choice, I want you to know, maybe make me your second choice, but I can work with others. Just imagine that campaign and imagine going into a voting booth and not feeling like you need to take a shower afterward. I think we can have that. I really, really do. And my hope is that, you know, I'll do this until I can't do it anymore. This is what I do now. It's become my project. My hope is that I can change the conversation and get people to think differently.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a first year at the law school. Thank you.
Welcome.
So you mentioned social media algorithms as well as gerrymandering as some causes for political polarization. And I suspect the latter is related to what I'm about to say, but I still want to hear if you have a more specific take on it, which would be partisan indoctrination in public schooling. Do you think that that's like a feedback loop, or?
So I do think, you know, it's really interesting. I think what's happening in public school education is something everybody should care about and find deeply disconcerting. I think we're reaching a point in this country where there are going to be states in which teachers of American history are going to be unable to actually teach American history in favor of a version of American history that we wish were ours but isn't. And I think that this is also a risk that could happen even in graduate schools. And I don't want to get too much into details for very specific reasons, but that's really what a lot of political leaders want. We're seeing it in Arkansas, we're seeing it in Florida, we're seeing this in a number of southern jurisdictions, but not exclusively southern jurisdictions. We're seeing pressure not to teach actual history, but to teach a version that will allow, in some peculiar perspective, people to feel better about themselves and about our history. And that's tragic. You know, I grew up in a very unusual, my dad was a collector of American and ancient Jewish history. That's what he did. I grew up basically in a very modest home. It was a rancher with one bathroom for four of us. My dad collected books and artifacts. It was a little like growing up on the floor of a Smithsonian museum. When both my parents passed away, it took us 2 years to sort through the tens of thousands of objects. One of the collections that my father had, he always said he had 30 collections. I couldn't figure out the boundary lines on these collections, but one of the collections that he had was a slavery collection. And neither my sister nor I really wanted to own this, but we absolutely didn't want to sell it because we didn't want to profit from this collection. We actually ended up donating it to the Reginald Lewis Museum, which was kind enough to take it in, and they did a lovely display. And I mention this because my father, who was one of the most patriotic people I've ever known in my life, held the view that part of being a patriot, part of actually caring deeply about a country, means all of it, reckoning with all of it, even its worst parts. The idea to my dad that you would only learn the parts of history that make you feel good about yourself would be so unrecognizable, you know? And so it really, really deeply troubles me to imagine this. And I'll tell you something. There's a textbook, and I sometimes share this slide with my students, and because of your question, I now feel guilty because I neglected to do it when I would have done it in this past class. There's a textbook that was used to teach American history in Virginia up until the 1970s. And I found online the open page picture of their chapter on slavery. And I really wish I had the slide. It would have been a wonderful thing to be able to show you. So you'll have to just take my description of it. Here's what it looks like. So you have a Black family, husband, wife, 2 children, 1 boy, 1 girl. They look as though they must have just taken showers and gone shopping because they're dressed in lovely clothing. And then you've got this few people working on the ship who happen to be white, and another white person coming over to shake hands with the father. This is literally, until the 1970s, the image in the picture drawn as an introduction to slavery, the history of slavery, is we have a beautifully dressed, obviously well-fed family that just went shopping. And the person who's going to own them is shaking hands like they're business partners. I'm not kidding you. I have the receipts. I actually have this. So when people say, I just have to say this, when I hear people say, this is about parental control, don't we want parents to have the ultimate decision for educating their children? My answer is, those are the last people I would want to have the ultimate control. Because they grew up with an image that may have been egregiously distorted. No, I want people who are deeply thoughtful about what our citizens should know to make curricular and content decisions about the whole school. The last people I want to be in control are people who have already been victimized by distorted renditions of the parents.
Maybe one more question.
Well, we do. Oh, go ahead. No. Oh, well, we do have one question from an online viewer. The question is, hi, Professor Stearns. My name is Chai Morale. I'm a med student here. As a med student, I think something I've been seeking to reconcile is whether it's possible for a physician to remain true to the apolitical ethics of medicine while recognizing that silence about systemic injustice is within itself a stance. So that's probably something a lot of students reckon with. How do they reconcile their work and their ability to maybe work with all kinds of people with their own views?
So I'm not a physician. I am married to an absolutely wonderful physician, a medical oncologist. I think that there are a couple of strands in that question that we need to sort out, and I'll do my best as a non-physician. I think physicians have to provide the best possible care to every individual who happens into their care without regard to the political views held by those patients. And if you cannot do that, you shouldn't be taking care of that patient, and you should be referring that patient to someone who can. I think, right? First, do no harm. You would be doing harm if you were taking care of a patient and not giving that person the best possible care because you held that person in contempt. You would be doing harm. You would be violating the Hippocratic Oath. So I think you have an obligation to be professional. I think that's true for lawyers too, right? I think it would be an application of the professional responsibility of a lawyer to represent a client you cannot represent to the best of your ability. If you cannot represent that client to the best of your ability, whether you agree with that client or not, you should not be representing that client. And I want to be clear that in my profession, it is entirely ethical to represent clients with whom you vehemently disagree and whose conduct you might find personally reprehensible. We would not have a system of criminal justice if there weren't lawyers representing people who did really bad things. Right? We wouldn't have due process. It's vital in my profession to take care of people as clients who you might profoundly disagree with or even find engaged in activities that will reference. Okay. The other part of the question is about holding and expressing particular political views. And I think that leaders across all professions have an obligation to become educated and to be thoughtful in the manner in which they express their views. Now, I want to be clear. Sometimes people get things right, sometimes people get things wrong, and if you are susceptible to only reading one side and not willing to consider seriously the other side, you might believe something that really should be challenged. One of the things I tell my students is, and this is a hard habit to develop, to the extent that you can, try to really press against, really try to interrogate things that you are inclined viscerally to viscerally to agree with. If you think something is naturally something you agree with, press hard against it, really interrogate. If there's something you are viscerally disinclined to agree with, you think it's dead wrong, try to think, is there something of value there? Am I missing something that motivates that person to have that contrary opinion? That's a difficult habit of mind. But the more you press yourself to engage that habit of mind, the better you are as a supporter. But more generally, the more you engage that habit of mind, the more thoughtful you'll be as a citizen. And I think it's really important. I don't think as a professional you have an obligation to expound publicly on every issue that's in the popular domain. But I also don't think that you should avoid talking about things that deeply matter to you. Part of it, I do think, is opening yourself up to really investigate rather than not just affirming, right? Not just finding things that confirm, right? Confirmation bias is following that culture. And it goes back to the media bias chart. It is all too easy. You can find sources that will ratify your beliefs. I can use a geeky term that will reinforce your Bayesian priors. You can find that again and again and again. But what you want to do is constantly try to challenge yourself and to make sure that when you are embracing a position that it's meritorious. I hope that's somewhat helpful.
And just before we thank Professor Stearns again, if we wouldn't mind, please join me in thanking the HSHSL facility staff who set up the space, as well as our OCPA team who's been video and live streaming. We could do a round of applause. And then thanks again to Professor Stearns for an excellent talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.